Alright, welcome everyone. This is our video looking at clauses a little closer than our introduction video. So I'm going to start out by talking about the two different types and then look at some of the details behind clauses that I think will help you in your sentence constructions. Alright, so first of all we have the independent clause, and this can also be called the main clause. You'll see them used independently, so just kind of associate them with each other. And then here we have the dependent clause, which is basically, as it sounds, dependent upon this. Otherwise, a dependent clause by itself will be an incomplete sentence or a sentence fragment, which is just a part of it. So basically, those are our two distinctions. And we'll be talking about them interchangeably throughout this video, so I'll be showing examples of what they are as we progress. Alright, so here's an example sentence. We have, he answered the phone when I called. Now this has a independent and dependent clause in it. If I asked you where the independent clause was, where would you say? Well, if we look at it this way, this can be an independent clause. For instance, if I said, who answered the phone? And you say, he answered the phone. Boom. We got our independent clause there. Now, could I say, who answered the phone? And then someone says, when I called. They're like, no, what do you mean when you called? So what we see here actually is we see the dependent clause here. Now, if you recall back to our video on phrases, the difference between a phrase and a clause was that a phrase has a subject or a verb, and a clause has a subject and a verb. So if you see here, we have a subject here, I, and a verb here, called. So for instance, could you say, and this is a way to check it, could you say, I called, and have that be a complete sentence? Sure. If the question was, did you call? I called. You know, like that would be very short, true, but it does have all of the ingredients for a complete sentence. So when you look at it this way, you can see quite readily that this part here is dependent on this part if we want to have a complete sentence. Also, it could be moved to the beginning here, and you could read it as, when I called, he answered the phone. Boy, that must be so nice when someone calls and they get a response, they get an answer. So you see already that we can begin to manipulate them. So those are the two different types and how you can move them. Let's look at the relationships that main clauses can have. Alright guys, so I have the four types here, and sorry if it gets a little bit cramped up there, but let me just show you what I've written here. Basically, these different relationships are very similar to the ones that we talked about with semicolons. And so for harmony or agreement, you could use words like furthermore, moreover, likewise, and besides, like if you were adding on to it in that sense or agreeing with it. With contrast, you can say something like, well, actually, before I move on, with harmony or agreement in thought, you could, for instance, also give an example using for example, or for instance, those types of words as well, which are very helpful. For a contrast in thought, however, yet, on the other hand, on the contrary, are very good choices as well. For alternation, you could say either, or either or, neither nor, otherwise, else, those types of things. Yet would also work as well. And then for consequence or inference, you could say therefore, as a result, hence, accordingly, those types of things. And we've discussed those with our semicolon practices, so this is where we start to see the two things blend. Alright, so for shifting gears now away from main clauses, let's look a little closer at dependent clauses. They are used in the sentence as a single part of speech, and they can either be a noun, an adjective, or excuse me, or an adverb. And that's similar to what we've been looking at with phrases, but the cool thing is with clauses is they can function much in the same way. They just typically have a little bit more detail within them. So let's take a look at a couple examples. This, I must preface you, has a lot more than what I'm about to share with you, but I'm going to try and just give you what I think are the most common applications of dependent clauses as these respective parts of speech to give you an example. I won't be able to give you every case, but I'll give you one of each. Alright, so here's a sentence where if you just look at the main sentence, where's the verb? The verb is here. So you would say, what is? That he will succeed is evident. So basically, what we see here in the red is a noun clause used as the subject of the verb is. That he will succeed is evident. And so that's one use of it. Now you could, express it in a different way. You could say something like, whatever you do will be satisfactory, or what you say is true. And for instance, you know that this is a clause because of this. The fact that it says, he will succeed. For instance, here, we could see that there's a subject and a verb there. So that's an example of a noun clause. I think you use them pretty regularly. These can be switched around. In this sentence, it'd be awkward, but let's look at another one. So noun clauses, they're used as a noun in a sentence. There's much more I can go into, but I'm going to try and just keep it simple with that, okay? Alright, so here's an adjective clause, or an adjectival clause. I've heard it kind of expressed different ways. So, where's the verb? Well, we have another is case. It's a very simple verb to use in creating a sentence. And so it says, the house where Shakespeare lived is now a museum. Well, if you ask yourself what the subject of the sentence is, you could say the house. Okay? The house is now a museum would be that main sentence. So if we isolate this sentence in that way, what we're left with in the middle is this, where Shakespeare lived. So if you're asking yourself, how is this a clause? Like, why is this a clause and not a phrase? Well, let's say I asked you the question, did Shakespeare live? And then I said, Shakespeare lived. Then I've expressed a complete thought, and I have a subject and a verb, and boom, you recognize that it's a clause. And so this is being used as an adjective to modify house, and we see a clause being used as an adjective. So let's look at our last case, and then I'm going to end this video. There's so much more I can say. It's like I'm just looking through my book, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, when do you stop? But I mean, no, we got to stop somewhere. So I'm going to look at adverbial clauses or adverb clauses, and we're going to wrap it up. Alright, so here's an adverb clause. And we have Byron wrote this poem when he was 80 years old. Okay? So we can say, where's the verb? Well, we got wrote. Okay? Subject, Byron. Byron wrote this poem. Boom. That's a complete sentence. Just, we could, for instance, end it right here. That is enough for it. But then we have all this. Goodness, what is this? Well, it's an adverb clause. For instance, the reason why it's a clause and not a phrase is because, again, we have subject and a verb. He was, for instance. He was. And this when he was 80 years old is an adverb modifying wrote. When did he write? When he was 80 years old. And so we can see how clauses can be these three different types of speech. And you could move this clause, for instance, easily to the beginning of the poem. You could say, when he was 80 years old, comma, Byron wrote this poem. So I'm going to show you just the last little bit here. Actually, forget that. I'm not. This is it. I'm going to stop it right here. These are the three different types of subordinate or dependent clauses, and we looked at the initial kind of broad relationships between main clauses and what they are. So let's practice this. Let's see where we're at, and thank you for watching.